afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the organizers and for the opportunity to come and discuss the mSToPS trial, and especially on behalf of our collaborators, as I'll try to emphasize as I go through this and discuss the trial, it's possible because we have some phenomenal collaborators. So it's really a triumvirate that put this together. So actually Scripps is the sponsor, and thanks to a grant from Janssen Pharmaceuticals, we're able to carry this out in collaboration with what I'm allowed to say is a major national payer at this point. But you may notice if you look in the abstract, we didn't know we were restricted, and so it says that in the abstract in the book. But it makes for a phenomenal collaboration. And then on top of Janssen and this national payer, we are working with three excellent partners in technology development, and I'll highlight all of those as I go through the trial. The mSToPS trial is focused on screening, looking for a way to screen for atrial fibrillation. I'm going to give a little background on atrial fibrillation and why this is really like an ideal target for screening technology. First of all, it's a major problem. So in 2015, it's anticipated about 6 to 7 million people in the United States alone have atrial fibrillation. This is a paper, the graph from a paper from 2013 that shows the predicted growth depending on some assumptions, the difference between the purple and the green line, but it's going to keep increasing. This is in the United States alone. Atrial fibrillation is associated with a 5-fold increase of stroke risk. So AFib in and of itself, as I tell many of my patients, is more of a nuisance than anything else, but it's this risk of stroke that's really the most significant complication of atrial fibrillation and why it's so important to recognize AFib. The good news of that is that treatment with oral anticoagulations, including titrated warfarin or one of several novel oral anticoagulants, can reduce stroke risk by nearly 70%. In cardiology at least, there's no therapeutic intervention that gives you that kind of risk reduction in such an important outcome such as strokes. So the capability of recognizing the right individuals and then getting them on the right therapy is critically important for preventing something that is patients, payers, and everybody would agree is a huge problem. The problem is really identifying people who have asymptomatic atrial fibrillation, and because of its nature, we don't really even know how many people out there have asymptomatic atrial fibrillation, but it's estimated to be about 30% of populations. I'm going to give some examples from some trials that have found asymptomatic individuals. One small study looked at just a little over 1,000 patients with hypertension, screened them for atrial fibrillation. They were elderly, mean age of 73, and found 16% who just had a diagnosis of hypertension, mostly over age 70, that 16% had atrial fibrillation. In a recent publication from the Framingham study, they were looking at the diagnosis of atrial fibrillation over the decades of the Framingham study. I'm going to focus on just the most recent data, which was from 1998 to 2007, where of the 491 new cases of atrial fibrillation diagnosed during that time, 133 or 27% were first detected on a routine study EKG. So that patients, maybe there were some who had symptoms and kind of waited until they had their study EKG if they were coming. But in general, that would suggest that the majority of those individuals didn't know they had AFib, had no symptoms, and were coming in for screening. And then finally, data from a study I'll go into in more depth next is STROKESTOP, where they screened over 7,000 individuals ages 75 or 76. That's how they got into the screening trial. They found that about 25% of all of the patients with atrial fibrillation were asymptomatic. They did not know they had atrial fibrillation. So in general, roughly maybe, depending on the population you're looking at, 25% or a little bit more have asymptomatic atrial fibrillation, and that's really the target population that if you can identify these people, change their therapies, put them on anticoagulation therapy, you can hopefully make a big difference in preventing a stroke in that population. So I want to highlight the STROKESTOP study because it really is, I think, the best study done to date by far on screening for atrial fibrillation. It was done in Sweden. It is still ongoing. They presented their early AFib detection results, but the long-term outcomes is a comparison in clinical outcomes. So to get into that study in 2 different geographic locations in Sweden, you had to be either age 75 or 76, and that was it. And you were randomized then to either being invited to be screened or not. So the patients not randomized to be screened are going to be the control observational group over time. The people who were invited to be screened then received a medical history, an EKG, and informed consent by visiting a screening center. So that meant about the 14,000 people who were randomized to be screened, only half of those actually ended up being screened because it required going to a center to start that screening process. And then those who were found not to have atrial fibrillation at the screening, on their screening EKG, those were given a Zenicor. As you can see, it's a little handheld EKG device, and asked for twice a day for 30 seconds to screen their EKG, and then on a daily basis, as well as if they ever felt palpitations, to also check their EKG. This is the overall result. I had mentioned already that about that 25% of the overall population had asymptomatic AFib of those who had AFib, but overall 3% of the screened population had new diagnosis of atrial fibrillation. What was interesting is the timing, because one of the things we don't know is, okay, are we just noticing prevalent AFib, so everybody was screened at the beginning, or over time? These are the data looking at in this essentially 2-week monitoring period. Even though the greatest number of people were diagnosed at one time in the screening EKG, that over time, actually there were 4 times more individuals were diagnosed with AFib over the 2-week screening period. And what's interesting to me and has impact on our study is that you see the curve, at least in this 2-week period, is not flattening out, that they're continuing to get new cases of atrial fibrillation over time. So it'll be interesting to better understand, and when you look at a risk population, if there's a time where you can stop monitoring and feel pretty good, or if continue. Other important findings were that in looking at the number of episodes of atrial fibrillation that individuals had. So remember, once you got out of the screening EKG, you just had 30-second monitoring for twice a day. So although on average the people who had atrial fibrillation had 4.5 episodes of atrial fibrillation diagnosed in the 28 or 30 times where they monitored their EKG, that actually a pretty substantial minority, almost 20% of the population, had only one 30-second episode of atrial fibrillation during the time of screening. And so that also would suggest that maybe having just the intermittent screening on twice a day, that you might be missing some patients with atrial fibrillation during that time, that these aren't people who are in continuous atrial fibrillation. So all of that kind of leads us to the objectives of our trial, the mSToPS trial. And so our objectives are first to identify a high-risk cohort suitable for screening for asymptomatic atrial fibrillation using claims data. Then we want to engage those individuals using mobile health technology and enabled home monitoring program in order to document previously undiagnosed atrial fibrillation. And then thirdly, we want to provide clinical evidence of an outcomes benefit associated with this early detection. And all of this, what makes it very exciting, it's all digital technology enabled, starting from the patient identification all the way to the clinical endpoints. So I'm going to go through an overview, which is unfortunately not very easy to see, but I'm going to go through the details of it. But it's not as straightforward but think of this as just the overview, and I'll go into the details. So first, there's a population from this major payer that's going to include roughly, we think right now, about 300,000 individuals who would meet the inclusion-exclusion criteria for the trial. Of those 300,000 individuals, we're going to start inviting them to participate through emails. Once we get 2,100 individuals to agree to participate, that's going to be our active monitoring randomized cohort. So those individuals will be randomized 1-to-1 to either immediate monitoring or delayed monitoring, and again, I'll go through the details of that. And then the primary endpoint will be the incidence of atrial fibrillation in the delayed versus the immediate monitoring cohort at 4 months. The trial is going to continue, obviously, where the delayed cohort will then undergo 4 months of monitoring. The initial cohort of 4 months of monitoring will just go back to usual standard of care. Also being established at the time of randomization and initial cohort development is an observational cohort that's matched based on age, gender, and risk factors. That observational, it's a 2-to-1 matching, so that's going to be an observational cohort of 4,000 individuals. This cohort is going to come from individuals in that 300,000 patient pool that don't get invited to participate in the trial. So these won't be patients who got invitation letters to participate in the trial. That's going to lead to a key secondary endpoint at 1 year of the incidence of atrial fibrillation in the combined monitored cohorts versus the observational control cohort. And then finally, we're going to continue following both of those groups to 3 years to look at the clinical endpoint, which is time to first event of stroke, MI, or systemic embolization in the actively monitored group compared to the observational cohort, and then also looking at overall cost and healthcare utilization. Let me dive down into some of the details of the study. The inclusion criteria are shown here. These are all based on historical information and risk factors, but I'll show you that we were able to confirm within the Aetna database. Oh, sorry. See, I knew I was going to say something. So ignore I just said that. Within our national payers database, these increased risks. So I think pretty straightforward inclusion and then exclusion criteria. Here is a graph looking at the relative risk of those populations within that large claims database, the relative risk of prevalent atrial fibrillation, which is important because obviously we have no way of looking at the incidence of asymptomatic atrial fibrillation, undiagnosed atrial fibrillation. But you can see we have this gradient, and then we're able to look at this in order to identify our patient population that we're going to reach out to. And we're still going to reach out to them as a large group, but we all have a general idea of our expected atrial fibrillation event rate if we assume about a 30%, 25 to 30% asymptomatic group. When patients are identified as being possible, and then we reach out to them by email to be recruited, and they're going to have a link for those who are interested to follow for mSToPS recruitment. And as I'll show you some pictures, this is developed by one of our partners, Parallel 6. You can see that one of the key aspects we want the members to get is, hey, having AFib is fun. Look at how much fun this couple is having. This is really great. They're smiling, they're happy. I want to find out. Yeah. Obviously, we want to, one of the nice things about these digital trials is that you can engage and better personalize the outreach to them, because the downside is there's not a human being standing there talking them into the study. And I've run clinical trials for over 15 years. I can remember twice where a patient has actually read the informed consent in front of me. So there's a lot of agreeing to be part of a trial that's based on the trust of that medical center, or the trust on the individual who's talking to them. We don't have that here, so we really have to make up for that and have a very engaging way of educating the potential participants, giving them information in a way that's useful to them, and it's geared towards their needs. And so I'm not going to be able to show in this presentation, but there are many layers here where patients can go into and find out more information and learn more about the study, and always with the default to call and talk to a person if they want to find out more. So if they're interested and they go to this page and say, okay, I'd like to find out more, they have the option of them watching a short video. It's a little bit less than 90 seconds, because in previous studies we found that that's about when patients will stop watching, or potential recruits will stop watching a video. Again, the message, atrial fibrillation, you're happy people, and so I'll show that, and then we get our rock star boss, Eric Topol, to talk a little bit and say why this is a very patient-centered thing and a great way to participate in this study. And then after they see the video and get a general idea of it, which they don't have to watch the video, they can, then they'll go through, and then there's information about the study, and I'm just showing one screenshot of that goes a little bit, it gives the details of it. So assuming the patient or the potential participant is still interested, then they can click on the informed consent and follow that path. And on the informed consent we've learned through prior experience and that too often you absolutely can't just go to a PDF of a regular informed consent. That's like, you know, asking somebody to sign away their life to someone that they don't know and don't trust. You lose a lot. So we really want to break it down into bite-sized pieces, always giving the patient on every one of these bits that they're exposed to ask questions, to look at frequently asked questions, or to call the research coordinator. So they'll walk through a bunch of pages. This is one of the first pages, a help page that just says at any time if you need help, you can click here. Then you go through what the purpose of the study is, that the information is secure and confidential, the time commitment that's required, voluntary participation, risks, confidentiality, and then kind of walking through the end and getting the signature at the end of all this. So this is still an area that I think that we're still refining. It's great to work with partners like Parallel 6 to help make that possible, and really one of the nice things also, it can be done very iteratively. So we are able to find out in real time, people are getting stuck on this page, they're not getting beyond this. How can we make that easier? How can we make it better? For the monitoring technology, we're also working with two very innovative developers, the iRhythm, which has the Zio patch. So remember in STROKESTOP, they just had the intermittent EKG twice a day. Well, the Zio patch, we're going to have individuals place it on them. It's going to be mailed to them. They're going to place it on their chest, which is what we do routinely clinically at Scripps and don't have any problems with, even though I'm sure in a large study it'll really cause some problems. And then they wear it for 2 weeks. They do everything they would normally do. There's no limitations. They don't have to see any doctors. They don't have to do anything. They just put it on, they wear it, they work out, they shower, they swim, whatever they want to do. And then after 2 weeks, they take it off, they put it back in the already stamped and addressed box, and they send it back in, where it's going to be read, and we'll have then a continuous single lead EKG over that 2-week period of time. It'll be overread, and we have an adjudication committee to look at any episodes of atrial fibrillation. So these individuals will be monitored for the first 2 weeks of the 4-month monitoring period and the last 2 weeks. So you can see drawn here in the immediate monitoring arm. And then the delayed monitoring arm, they're going to get the monitors, the Zio patches, the first 2 weeks of, so essentially it'll be at 4 months, and then 2 weeks after that, and then two weeks at the end of that 8-month period will it be monitored. And the reason for the split monitoring period is to really distinguish between the prevalent AFib in the early 2 weeks, and then comparing that to how many new cases we'd find in the last 2 weeks of that in both of the arms and the groups, which I don't think would ever go forward clinically, but in this case will tell us a lot of really useful information as the best way to monitor. This is the gold standard which is being used. The Zio patch is FDA approved, and every patient is being monitored with that. A subgroup of about 500, so about a quarter of the population, will also be randomized to an exploratory study. So these individuals will get the Zio patch and also a wristband, an Amigo wristband. It looks very much like a lot of other wristbands. It uses photoplasmography to measure pulse rate, and it does this routinely every 20 minutes when it's daytime, and every 7 minutes during nighttime for 30 seconds. It can also, and we're going to build into the program where we're going to ask participants, if you sit still, if now's a good time to sit still for a minute, we want to monitor your heart rhythm. And then these are the kind of data they retrieve. In the top part is a normal sinus rhythm pulse wave. In the bottom graph is an atrial fibrillation pulse wave. It would be nice if all of them were this clear cut when we see, but we'll be able to see, and for a good number of patients, we know we'll have overlap between the Amigo device and their pulse wave readings as well as the EKG. For any individuals who during that period of time between wearing the Zio patch, if they have suspected atrial fibrillation, because the Amigo is an exploratory device, we're going to send them another Zio patch to confirm that diagnosis of atrial fibrillation. So no, for the purpose of this study and for clinically, no diagnoses of atrial fibrillation are going to be based on just the Amigo device. So just like with the Zio patch, but differently, so now this is going to offer the ability to continuous monitoring. So there's not just going to be these episodes of 2 weeks and 2 weeks, but actually through the whole 4-month period, individuals will be wearing the Amigo or will be encouraged to wear the Amigo. And then the same in the delayed continuous will also wear the Amigo every day. And I mentioned they'll also have the Zio patch at times. So the primary endpoint, as I mentioned, is the incidence of newly diagnosed AFib, which we're defining as at least 30 seconds of atrial fibrillation or flutter by EKG, or a new clinical diagnosis at the end of the 4-month monitoring period in the immediate cohort compared to the delayed monitoring cohort. Key secondary endpoints are going to be the incidence of new diagnosis of atrial fibrillation at 1 year in the combined actively monitored cohorts, so overall population of about 2,000 individuals versus the match observational controls of about 4,000. Also, as I mentioned, time to first event of stroke, systemic emboli, or MI in patients diagnosed with AFib at year 3 in the monitored versus controlled cohorts, and then the overall difference in total healthcare costs in the AFib cohorts in the monitored and control groups. So in summary, I think mSToPS, thanks to an innovative and collaborative partnership between STSI, Janssen, and a major national payer that you'll never guess, the mSToPS, it's really able to take advantage of multiple digital medicine technologies that will enable targeted patient outreach to only eligible patients. So we're not screening a bunch of people who aren't eligible. We know everybody we reach out to, or 99% of them will be eligible based on clinical parameters and confirmed heightened risk. This is going to be a nationwide study, but it's all directed out of just Scripps, and allows, that's allowed by our digital outreach, education, and informed consent. It's a very patient-friendly, real-world monitoring without the need for any study-specific visits, so we think that'll keep patients engaged and make patients more likely to want to join. And then finally, long-term follow-up of important clinical outcomes as well as resource utilization will be captured routinely versus claims data. So there are no case report forms, there's no reaching back out to patients at 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, beyond just keeping them engaged. It's very important to us to make sure patients know the results, their results as well as the results of the overall trial, but there's no study-specific visits and needs. So on my final slide, I just want to say, in 15 years of clinical trials, I'd say that this is really the most transformational trial that I've ever been part of, and I'm very proud to be part of the group that's putting this together. First of all, it's very pragmatic, right? So there's nothing, very little that's study-specific that requires anything unusual for the patient. It's really taking advantage of mobile technology to fit right into people's lifestyle and make it as simple as possible. It's also widely applicable. So this isn't a trial that can only be done by the partners that we've talked about here. It can be done by anybody who has a large data set. I used to be at Geisinger. Geisinger has a huge population they could reach out to using the same information, using the same technology. But more importantly, I think that it can be immediately improved upon. So what we find, people may say, okay, well that's fine, but we think we can do a better job identifying patients at risk. Or we think now, because we have new technology, better technology, we can even do identify a greater population, better population to target with newer technology and better technology. So I'm hoping that we have IRB approval. The trial is scheduled to start in about 3 weeks, and so hopefully in a year, if I have the opportunity to come back and talk, I won't look like a liar, and it'll look like we were able to accomplish at least a good part of this. And again, I want to thank all of you for the opportunity to present this, as well as our partners for giving me the opportunity to speak on their behalf. Thank you, everybody.